Internet required a lot of cooperation. You need companies to work together. You need the companies to all be using the same protocols and the same technology. Now, AI doesn't really have that technical requirement. It's in fact kind of the opposite incentive structure. What governments think about when they think about security versus what companies think about when they think about security might be completely different, and also might be different from the way we all would like the internet to be secure and safe for us. So with all of those different actors out in the world trying to use the same technology, you do have to create policy development so that there's harmony. So I'm sort of there to try to represent not companies and not governments, but all of us when we are deliberating over the design of the technology or the mechanisms and policies that govern it globally.
Welcome, everyone. Our topic today is about the internet. Internet is a backbone of our daily lives, of our economies, but a lot of us are unaware of who governs it. And today I'm joined by somebody who is an expert in this field, who works at the intersection of technology and human rights. She's also an author of the book, How the Internet Works, and she's joining us from Washington, D.C. So thank you, Mallory, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to you and your audience today about internet governance.
I'll jump right in, Mallory. So when we talk about this concept of internet governance, it may come across as a bit abstract to a non-expert audience. So can you define what this term is?
Well, I think I'd first start by, reminding us of, I think, an intuition that we already have, which is that the internet is a global technology. It's a global resource. And to that end, we really have to govern it together. There aren't many things like that. I think the other example we have from modern history is telephony. That all required the International Telecommunication Union in the 1800s to be established, because it was clear that everyone around the world that was interested in this technology existing in their country needed to first understand it, being able to deploy it, and that all of these different places that were deploying it actually were using the same technology. So in that sense, we really have to imagine the effort that has to go in to something as far, far more complicated than telephony. But the two frames I really operate within are technical design and then policy development. So in the technical design, the early sort of inventors, if you will, of the internet were concerned about one thing and one thing only, and that was scaling. It was getting to the point where everyone around the world was using it. And so the technology is it can be in some cases somewhat brittle, in the sense that it's really, the design is very simplistic, easy to use, easy to understand, and easy to deploy everywhere, because that's what they were concerned about in the beginning. And so the evolution then of the technical design is sort of, you add in some other concerns later, like security. It's not a consideration for technology that you needed to scale quickly, because security is a very heavy concept, and it creates a lot of barriers to implementation. So that's why we've had to focus a lot now on the way that these protocols and technologies consider security in a different way than it used to. So that's one vector for the way this is evolved. But of course, what governments think about when they think about security versus what companies think about when they think about security might be completely different, and also might be different from the way we all would like the internet to be secure and safe for us. So that's why I think it's important to have representative voices when we're thinking through the design of more secure and better internet protocols. So that's the sort of technical piece. Now, on the policy development piece, you also have so many different players. Again, like you have governments, many, 200 plus countries, right? And territories and so on. There's, government is actually kind of a regions, they have an expansive view of what government means in technology policy. And then you have so many companies, right? Because a lot of the internet, if not all of it, in almost every corner, has been built upon capitalist market logic. This idea that if you can incentivize operators then they will deploy this. Even if the internet is considered maybe a civic right at this point, because so much of our lives are intermediated by the internet, your interfacing with your own government might require you to have an email address and other kinds of things. Um, that still is deployed by companies, a series of companies, and hopefully many companies, so that they compete. Again, like we're using capitalist market logic. So, with all of those different actors out in the world trying to use the same technology, you do have to create policy development so that there's harmony, right? That there's a healthy amount of competition, there's a healthy amount of cooperation, and that balance remains good for, the market, ostensibly the rest of us, right? So that, you can have these different companies talking about the technical designs that I was mentioning before, but that also can operate across jurisdictions in different global regions. There needs to be some harmony with respect to, paying your share upstream to the other provider, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of policy that's also required there. And some of it's national, some of it's regional, some of it's global. There's not a whole lot of examples of global policy, just because I think that can add a lot of complexity to national sovereignty and things like that. But there are some examples we could talk about.
So my question was that technology is ahead and regulation follows because it's just this space. So if you can just tell us about this history of how internet governance ecosystem sort of came about.
I'll start with the internet and end with AI, I hope. Yeah, so I do think that there have been calls for regulation for quite some time. The first main issue, I think, for a lot of um, public interest advocates is privacy. There's just this massive risk of privacy violations, and we've seen it. It's now been more than 10 years that the world learned about the spy network that the US had instantiated with the Five Eyes countries and the way that they were using online communications to effectively monitor everyone all over the world. Then the next thing I think people started to notice was like the technology companies became very large, especially in the US. But even, the technology companies in the US became large in other jurisdictions and other markets. Companies benefit the same way governments benefit if they have access to the data. Now we know they were sort of using that data to do all kinds of other things today. We think of it as manifesting in AI, but it was also sort of serving ads and that sort of thing. Um, the other thing to note about the main shift between internet and AI now is that the internet required a lot of cooperation, as I talked about many times already. You need companies to work together. You need the companies to all be using the same protocols and the same technology so that they're effectively using one internet. Now, AI doesn't really have that technical requirement. It's in fact kind of the opposite incentive structure. The more proprietary, the more secret your methods are for building your large models, the more successful and more competitive you can be. And so there's no real deep technical inherent incentive to be cooperative. And so that balance between you need cooperation and you need competition has been knocked out of balance for AI. They're not in harmony. And so that does present some real problems, I think new, fresh problems. And so internet governance, people like me, hopefully can be useful in terms of having some continuity, having some experience and relationships and all of that. But it is a different technology, and it's going to require a lot of different advocacy angles to try to ensure that whatever gets built is properly regulated. And that is the one thing that I've invited, is because, you know, um, when the internet first started, it was kind of exciting. We were all really hoping that this would be really great for small businesses, people, civic space, social movements and everything. With AI, I feel like there's been a lot of folks really worried about it. So it's kind of it's in its beginnings, in its provenance, it has sparked fear. It's not always well placed, but I do think that it's allowed for us to have some rapid approaches to regulation, like you were saying. And so that we are really thoughtful and focused on regulating AI from the beginning, very different from the way we talked about it in the internet. I think it's going to actually help us retroactively regulate some of the internet in ways that we should have done a while ago. And so that is something that I invite. That's something that I think plays well with the ways companies implement technology that has been standardized and the technical designs have been established. And then you have this top sort of to create this, triangle, you have this piece around regulation that can really help dictate both, which is I'm hoping will be useful.
So, Mallory, if the policymakers in Pakistan are listening to you, what would be your message to them?
This is a great question, and I really appreciate the opportunity to even be able to articulate things like this. I think working with governments and working with regulators is one of the most impactful things that we can do as advocates, next to being in the room when we decide on how these technologies are designed. So I think that one other thing that's happened very recently is at the UN in New York, there's been a new treaty on cybercrime. Has sort of replaced what was there before, which is a Budapest Convention for Europe, that was effectively the sort of cybercrime convention people were using. This new cybercrime treaty, the reason I bring it up is I think it's really illustrative of the kind of thing that I worry about and would talk to regulators in Pakistan and other places about. Um, is that the treaty, of course, does need some human rights safeguards. This idea that countries can now request data for crime, for investigating crimes, for taking criminals to court internationally, and so on and so forth, is really, important to have those clear mechanisms in place with those human rights safeguards, so that we're not, for example, treating, all crime in the world as cybercrime just because, the internet intermediates basically everything we do, right? That you need these guardrails in place so that you don't have things that are considered crimes in some jurisdictions that actually contravene international humanitarian and international human rights law. Uh, I think when you have a context like a jurisdiction where you're creating regulation, you're implementing treaty language, that you actually go above and beyond what has already been set in these what has already been set in these provisions on human rights, because they really are basic. They're not elaborated, and they're quite short. So I think the main issues are, I've talked a lot about privacy, so you'll not be surprised when I say having common sense privacy regulation to protect end users and businesses and just everyday people, because we talk to our parents, we talk to our doctors, we talk to, everyone using the internet. Those things need to be protected and private. Um, we that's like just basic, right? But there are other things as well. I think that we are in almost every corner a very over compliant society at the moment. Some of that has had to do with the points of control that technology enables. So civic space is has been rolled back almost everywhere. There just aren't enough public demonstrations anymore. People are not expressing themselves in large groups. There's a lot of fear of large groups, right? In a way that I think can really repress social expression and really ossify our societies because we don't have, this healthy and robust civic space. So really thinking through how we can both be safe, but not give everyone the sense that, they really mustn't act out because we're watching you and so on. So I think it's hard to tell a government this. I've not been super successful in my advocacy over the years, but restraint is so important. And restraint from spying, restraint from overburdening people, I think, with this notion that they must comply at all times because we can see what you're doing. I think that has a very deep psychological effect as well. And I'll sort of stop there because I'm not giving like really direct and I think actionable suggestions for policymakers. But I do have a piece coming out soon that is a briefing document for policymakers on the UN Cybercrime Treaty and what they can do effectively in legislation to make sure that their implementation of this treaty doesn't go too far and overstep on human rights and actually goes above and beyond what the treaty calls for.
Just on the closing note, Mallory, what is the mission that you're on, and what is it that you would like to see more of in this world?
To me, I see the human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, actually through my nerd eyes, as a kind of standard. I think that we came together to build consensus around what it means to, at a bare minimum, give people the human dignity, right? And that has been established. In technical standard spaces, there are consequences to those decisions for human rights, good and bad, right? I'm just there really to try to bring those conversations together. And I think that's been the right big bet to make in my career for the last couple of decades because we are only using the internet more, not less. Digital tools are infiltrating every aspect of our lives. And if there are consequences for human rights, that is absolutely a front of struggle. That is a place where we need to pay attention. And so really that's my mission. I love ideas of well-being and joy and, other kinds of public interest issues like democracy and things like that. Great. But I am laser focused on the human rights framework because it's actionable, because we have a global network of human rights organizations, because every country in the world has signed on to the UDHR. It's effective, and implementing it in governance, internet governance, and standards bodies is what I do.
Thank you so much, Mallory. We're short on time, and it was our first ever Connect conversation. Sparked some ideas. I was just going to start asking you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much. It was lovely meeting you. Thanks for all your insightful questions. Bye.